You've known for a long time that something larger is waiting for you. Not a suspicion, not a hope. A quiet, unshakable knowing, the kind that sits in your chest like a second heartbeat. A pressure that doesn't ease no matter how many reasonable decisions you make to silence it. And still, the distance between that knowing and what you've actually done about it remains. That's the contradiction every morning opens inside you. Naming it isn't judgment. Naming it is just the only honest place to start. Most people never get close enough to that contradiction to really feel it. A vague dissatisfaction stirs, and they fill it with noise before it can say anything. But feeling the gap, that's already evidence of something. The discomfort isn't a sign you failed. It's a signal that something in you is already online, already waiting. Think about how a blueprint behaves before a structure is built. There's a period of absolute containment, no announcements. No progress reports shared with people who aren't ready to receive them. The architect doesn't hand the plans to every passerby and ask what they think. They stay in the dark, developing slowly, because the wrong light at the wrong moment destroys the image before it can hold. You've shared your blueprints like conversation material before. That's not a moral failing. It's a gap in the protocol, and the pattern is the same every time. The wrong ear causes something to collapse, even when you can't quite explain why. There's a specific kind of pressure drop that happens when you speak a vision before it has enough internal mass to survive contact with the outside world. A vision is a forming thing. Words are release valves. Open that valve too early, before the pressure has built into something real, and the force that was supposed to carry you forward escapes into the air. The charge dissipates. What could have become something solid becomes another half-finished thing the world got to touch before it could defend itself. A door was left open this morning. Not forced, not broken, just unsecured. No visible threat stood near it. But an open door is an invitation the occupant never meant to extend. That image will come back. For now, let it sit exactly where it is. Pause. There's a name for what happens when a blueprint meets the wrong frequency before it can hold its shape, and that name changes how you move forward from here. It asks you to stay. Because what follows isn't about paranoia. It's about something more like physics, and just past it is something quieter, a silence that was never empty, only waiting to be recognized. You grew up with a loneliness you couldn't explain to anyone who loved you. Not because you were alone, because you were surrounded by people who saw a version of you and stopped looking. They loved what they could perceive. What they couldn't perceive made them uncomfortable, and so they gave it smaller names. Too intense. Too serious for the room. A phase you'd grow out of. You didn't grow out of it. It grew into you. That loneliness wasn't a wound looking for a cure. It was a perimeter alarm, the first signal that something in you operated on a frequency the people around you couldn't hold. And because they couldn't hold it, they couldn't confirm it. When you spoke about what you sensed, what you saw before it arrived, what you knew without being able to say how, the faces around you shifted. Not dramatically. Just slightly. A door closing somewhere behind the eyes. You learned to stop speaking before you had any language for why you were stopping. That wasn't cowardice. It was accommodation. You were adjusting your output to an environment that couldn't receive your signal without distorting it. The distortion came as dismissal, as being labeled difficult, as being told you were imagining things by people who couldn't imagine what you were actually perceiving. And over time, you swallowed that dismissal and called it self-doubt. The self-doubt became a cover story for a sensitivity that made ordinary life feel like too much, crowded rooms that drained you in minutes, conversations that left a residue you couldn't shake, certain people whose presence felt like a door slamming even when they were smiling at you. That sensitivity has been treated like a problem your whole life, I want to give it a different name. What it actually is threat detection hardware, counterintelligence capability. And it's been doing its job the entire time. Pause. So I want to ask you something directly. What did it cost you to stay silent before you had any language for this? Not the silence you chose later. The silence that was chosen for you when you were too young to know a choice was being made. You swallowed words because the room couldn't hold them. You learned to read faces before you ever learned to trust your own voice. And the cost of that wasn't just lost expression. It was lost calibration. You spent years doubting a signal that was never wrong because the people around you didn't have receivers sensitive enough to pick it up. That cost you time. It cost you relationships where you performed a smaller version of yourself just to stay in the room. It cost you the ability to tell the difference between someone who is genuinely safe and someone who is simply not hostile, and those aren't the same thing. You're still paying that debt every time you hesitate before saying something you already know is true. You didn't know you were an intelligence asset. Nobody told you, nobody trained you. So you treated the hardware like a malfunction instead of what it was. You buried it. That's the second thing. You tried to bury it under relationships that never quite held, not broken, not failed in any way most people would recognize, but built for something different than what you were becoming. The people you chose were often genuinely good people, but they were calibrated to a version of you running on reduced power. The full signal unsettled them, not because they were unkind, because their own wiring wasn't built for the bandwidth you required. So the relationship existed inside a quiet contradiction, real affection on both sides, and a fundamental mismatch neither of you could name without feeling ungrateful for the love that was actually there. You've wondered whether you're difficult to love. That's the wrong question. You're difficult to calibrate to when someone is running an entirely different system. That's not a love problem, it's a compatibility problem that wears the face of a love problem because most people don't have the language to tell the difference. You walked away from perfectly good relationships, not because you wanted to, but because staying meant cutting yourself into pieces small enough for another person to carry, and something in you kept a quiet accounting of what that was costing. Then the calling came, not once. Not in some single dramatic moment with a soundtrack. It came quietly, and it kept returning, no matter how many times you buried it. You buried it under career ambitions, under practical responsibilities, under the reasonable-sounding argument that real spiritual maturity means accepting an ordinary life, that the sense of being called to something is just ego dressed in holy clothes. That argument almost held. It held for months at a time. And then you'd wake at 3 in the morning with a knowing so sharp it cut clean through every layer of justification you'd built. Pause. You were being summoned. Not asked. Summoned. The difference matters because asking permits refusal. Summoning doesn't. Summoning waits. So let me restate the core of what we're talking about, because it's worth holding clearly. A sealed blueprint develops density where no outside frequency can reach it. The darkroom doesn't just protect the image from light, it's the only place where the image can become fixed enough to survive light. That's operational physics. Say it differently, your calling isn't a secret to be guarded, it's a forming life with one vulnerable phase, and during that phase, exposure isn't connection, it's structural damage. Say it in the shortest form possible, the blueprint needs darkness the way a bone needs calcium. Without it, the architecture can't hold. 3 ways of saying the same thing. Let it settle. You've had private moments with God that were more real than anything you've ever done in public. Moments where the veil went thin and you weren't performing belief, weren't reciting what you'd been taught. You were encountering something so immediate and so undeniable that ordinary reality felt like the imitation. Those weren't hallucinations. They weren't wish fulfillment. They were contact events. and they changed the ground under your feet. You came out of those moments altered and had no one to tell. What would you have said? To whom? In what language? The experience had no container that ordinary conversation could hold. If you tried to describe it, you sounded unstable. If you stayed quiet, you carried something too sacred to reduce and too real to ignore. So you lived inside a silence no one around you could read correctly. They thought you were withdrawn, you were containing. They thought you were depressed. You were processing something that had no file format any of your relationships could open. That's the pattern. 5 beats of it, if you've been tracking. And here's what the pattern means in plain terms. You've been functioning as an unsecured node inside an environment that can't receive your signal without distorting it. And that environment isn't just the people around you, it's the entire frequency in which most human interaction happens. Every time you speak openly about what you're building, what you're sensing, what you know is coming, you're not sharing, you're leaking. And leaking has a cost. It's the mechanism by which a blueprint gets intercepted before it can take form. There's a protocol with 3 steps, and it's the third one most people never hear. I'll give you all 3, but the third will only make sense after you understand what comes before it. First, though, you need to understand exactly who's listening when you speak. Pause. I want you to feel something for a moment. Not analyze it. Just feel it. The exhaustion you carry, it's not about sleep. You sleep. You've tried sleeping more. It didn't change anything. This is a different kind of tired. It's the exhaustion of translating yourself into a language your environment can understand every single day without a break, without acknowledgement that translation work is work. You wake up already behind on a debt that accumulated before your feet touched the floor. And that debt isn't physical, it comes from a specific source most people never identify. You're running 2 systems at the same time. One is the system that keeps you moving through ordinary life, the job, the conversations, the practical arrangements that hold your physical existence together. The other is the system that's receiving incoming transmissions from your actual assignment. And those don't stop when you clock in. They don't pause during small talk. They're always on, always receiving, always pulling a portion of your bandwidth. Not a small portion. The majority share. Living with 1 foot in 2 frequencies isn't sustainable. But you've been doing it for years, and here is where something beneath the surface starts to show itself. Not a career path or a 5-year plan, something deeper than that. The architecture that governs timing, alignment, the way energy gets distributed across more layers of existence than most people ever have to think about. What the nervous system reads as dysregulation, something else in you reads as a holding pattern. A long, quiet orbit around a place that hasn't been cleared for landing yet. The grief, the dysregulation, the ache at midnight, these aren't signs that something's broken. They're instruments. What a soul uses to navigate when the map it was handed looks nothing like the actual terrain. The body keeps the score, yes. But something deeper keeps the coordinates. It knows exactly how far off you are, not in miles, but in degrees, and it won't stop signaling until that gap closes. That's why the hum never stops. It's not a warning light. It's a homing beacon. And just past the edge of that tiredness, on the other side of all those years of waiting, something else has been waiting just as long. Something that doesn't share the nervous system's exhaustion. It has watched the detours, the dead ends, the silence that followed the honest prayers. And it has been forming a response, not a polished one, not a careful one, something closer to a verdict. You've never said that anger out loud. Not fully. Not in words that match its actual size. You've offered softer versions. You've shaped your prayers around it in language that left a small door open back to gratitude, but you've never let it fill the room. Never let it expand to its real dimensions. And here's what needs to be said about that. The anger isn't a sin. It's not a flaw in your character. It's the accurate response of someone who has been running and supported in difficult terrain, with no backup and no extraction plan. Carrying this alone was never how it was supposed to go. There was supposed to be a structure, a perimeter. Things you were supposed to learn before you were asked to live through them. So if you're hearing this while that anger still sits warm in your chest, the anger isn't the problem. It's not the enemy. It's data. It points with precision to exactly where the breaches happened. Every situation that still stings when you turn it over, each one is a map of the moment the circuit opened and the voltage dropped. The frustration isn't really about the people who dismissed what you were building. It's that you gave them access before it could defend itself. The anger is your internal security system flagging an intrusion, not a breakdown. A report. It's telling you where things went unsecured, where they broadcast outward before they were ready. Feel it now, not as punishment, but as that report finally placed in your hands. Read it. You can't seal the perimeter while you're looking away from it. Something got named just now that hadn't been named before. That was intentional, because the refusal to look at a breach doesn't close it. The refusal to name a violation doesn't restore what was taken. Silence about the damage only guarantees it happens again. The anger isn't the wound. It's the evidence of the wound. And evidence, once acknowledged, becomes instruction. So here's the shift. Every breach the anger has been mapping is a coordinate, precise, recoverable, something you can actually work with. Where the voltage dropped is exactly where the reinforcement needs to go now. That's what the anger has been carrying this whole time. Not fuel for grievance. Material for building. The record it leaves behind isn't a sentence. It's a revision to the blueprint. Now something needs to be said that will feel like the opposite of what you've been taught about spiritual maturity. But before it arrives, let a principle be restated once more so nothing gets lost. A vision held in silence accumulates the pressure it needs to become structure. When it's contained, the energy compacts instead of scattering. Containment isn't suppression, it's the kiln. It's the forge. A blueprint protected in the dark becomes something that can't be dissolved when the light finally hits it. That's the first restatement. And a second, the silence isn't emptiness, it's a pressure vessel. The way a sealed tank lets a gas reach a density an open room never will. A contained vision builds the force required to push through concrete when the time comes. And the third, keep the blueprint inside the perimeter and it hardens into something the world can't break. Speak it too soon and it shatters into pieces that take years to reassemble. 3 articulations. 1 truth. Pause, let it settle, and just past that settling, something quieter. A question that doesn't demand an answer, only attention. What happens when the vessel finally seals completely, when the pressure is allowed to reach its full capacity, where nothing leaks, nothing escapes before it's ready? Something vast begins to happen underneath the stillness. Pull back far enough and you can see it. This pattern exists at every scale. A seed underground. A planet forming inside a nebula. A human heart developing in the quiet dark before it takes its first breath. None of them announce themselves. None of them send out progress reports. And yet something undeniable is happening. Something enormous. Not held back. Not moderated for the comfort of anyone nearby. Allowed to build. That word matters. Most people don't allow the pressure. They manage it. They bleed it off in small doses through explanation, through justification, through the need to be understood before the work is finished. But a vessel designed to hold something of real voltage doesn't manage the pressure. It trusts the design. It lets the pressure build until the internal climate transforms permanently. What was vapor becomes liquid. What was liquid becomes something the outside world can't dissolve. That's not a metaphor. That is the precise sequence of anything that survives contact with an environment built to dismantle what it doesn't recognize. Pause here and hold this image. A single seed beneath frozen ground. No report. No visibility. No one watching. The entire biological future of an oak tree compressed into something smaller than a fingertip, and it doesn't whisper a syllable about what it's becoming. The pressure inside that husk is absolute. The silence isn't empty, it's instructional. Every cell receives the blueprint without interference. The environment isn't consulted. No opinion is gathered from the surrounding soil. The seed doesn't leak its design into the earth and wait for feedback. It holds. It waits until the internal matrix is complete. And then it moves. That's the physics of containment, and it's the only physics that produces anything lasting longer than its first season. Now pull wider. Not one seed, a field of them. A forest floor. Entire ecosystems waiting in the dark, none of them speaking, none of them leaking, every single one following the same law. Density before emergence. The pressure climbs until the husk can no longer contain what it's become, and then the breakthrough isn't an announcement. It's a structural inevitability. The seed doesn't decide to emerge. It can't stay sealed once the pressure reaches threshold. That's the inversion worth sitting with. Most people think containment means holding back. It's the opposite. Containment is what lets the pressure climb until emergence is no longer a choice. It becomes a law, and the law doesn't check your social circle first. It doesn't ask whether the people around you are ready for what you're carrying. It builds, quietly, exponentially, until the only option is breakthrough. Pause. The frequency bleed happens when a vessel opens the seal too early. That's the whole mechanism. Nothing more complicated than that. Nothing personal. The vision doesn't fail because it was wrong. It fails because the gap between the internal field and the external environment was too wide, and the seal was lifted before the internal structure could withstand the collision. You spoke it. You showed it. You handed it to containers that were never built to hold that frequency. And the doubt didn't need to be spoken out loud to enter the circuit. Unconscious skepticism, ambient, invisible, automatic, introduced static into a transmission that needed absolute clarity. The next instruction couldn't be heard. The signal jammed. You called it failure. It was interception. This isn't a judgment on anyone who loves you. Love and calibration are different systems entirely. A person can love you completely and still be the wrong container for an unfinished blueprint. Their internal architecture simply wasn't shaped to hold that frequency. Asking them to hold it was like pouring water into a vessel built only to carry light. Nothing wrong with the water. Nothing wrong with the vessel. But together, the combination produced loss. Seeing that clearly isn't arrogance. It's precision. The same precision a surgeon uses when choosing an instrument. Not every tool belongs in every wound. Not every ear belongs in every silence. And just past that recognition, there's a freedom that's been waiting. Since the first time you handed something unfinished to someone who couldn't hold it. Pause. Consider what lives on the other side of that. Past the moment of recognition, past the negotiation, past the daily splitting of yourself between two streams that never quite meet. There's a territory beyond that friction, not a reward exactly, more like walking into a room that was already prepared and realizing the door was never locked. Just very quiet. What waits there isn't a louder version of the surface life. It's not more productivity or better systems or a smarter way to squeeze the blueprint into whatever margins remain. It's a different order entirely, one where the two lives stop competing for the same hour and start functioning as a single architecture. The surface becomes transparent. The depth becomes visible, not to everyone, that would defeat the whole point, but visible enough that the pressure inside the chest releases by several degrees. And that release alone changes the quality of every decision that follows. Then upper life thinks in increments, quarters, deliverables, sensible milestones that can be explained over coffee. The lower life thinks in transmissions. It doesn't measure at all, it simply carries a complete shape and waits for the moment when that shape can finally descend into form without being bent out of true by the demands of the surface. Most people never let it descend fully. They negotiate, they release just enough of the transmission to ease the pressure, but not enough to disturb the architecture of the life everyone recognizes.